Holy One, may the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So Jesus is baptized in the Jordan, and the heavens open up, and God says, "This is my Son, my beloved." And then the very next thing is this, the story we hear today, this time in the desert, no eating, no company, nothing to do, it seems. And then the temptations. You've heard this story before. And the question I have for today is, why? It says that the Spirit drove Jesus out. It says that the Spirit wanted Jesus to go through this. And my question is, why? If this is the Son of God, who in some way is a particular Son of God, not just a Son of God the way we're all sons and daughters of God, but uniquely the Son of God, why does he need to do this? Did he have to prove himself? Did God not know who he was or what he could do? What if he had fallen to the temptation? Had other guys like him gone out and failed the test before? Here's why I think Jesus went through this. Because of, I'm going to say it, get ready, because of sin. As I said earlier today, this Lent, we're taking a look at the practice of confession. You can read more about what we'll be doing. I hope you'll join us for it on page 7. But it seems to me that before we can do that, before we can talk about confession, we need to talk a little bit about just exactly what we need to confess. What sorts of things make the cut for needing confession? Of course, in one sense, anything that you've done or been a part of that's eating away at you, that you just can't let go of, is up for confession. But most precisely, most technically, that which needs to be confessed is, I'll say it again, sin. I said it twice now. I said that word here in a progressive, forward-thinking, open congregation like ours. I said it, sin. Such a little word. One freighted with more meaning than it seems like those 3 little letters should be able to bear. You don't hear a nasty word like that much in nice places like this. One good reason for that is that many of us have had it used like a weapon against us in the past. For things like speaking out or speaking up, or for falling in love with the quote-unquote wrong sort of person. It's only 3 letters, but those of us who have been beaten over the head with it often enough know how big and heavy a word it actually is. Love the sinner, hate the sin almost never works out well for the so-called sinner, does it? And so we're wary of it, rightly so, because we don't want to be like those who have wielded it against us or against those we love in the past. But, you knew there was a but, I think we do ourselves a disservice by not finding meaningful, gentle, and loving ways to talk about it. Because the fact is that even if none of us is talking about sin, most of us are doing it. At least sometimes. And if we're not talking about it, at least sometimes, we risk isolating ourselves. We risk thinking that everyone around us is perfect and we are the only ones who make mistakes or screw up or sin despite our best efforts. We risk finding ourselves wandering alone in the desert, thinking that everyone else is at home, safe, and well-behaved. But what is it? How do you know you've done it or are about to do it? You go to the wedding of a friend and you think she looks hideous in her wedding dress. She asks you what you think and you say, "You look gorgeous." You just lied, but did you sin? You're mad at your spouse about something relatively minor, and so you give them the silent treatment all evening long. Go to sleep with your back turned just to teach them a much-needed lesson. You didn't break any commandments, but did you sin? You follow every commandment, rule, law, and guideline assiduously. You come to a full stop at every sign. You give 10% of your income to worthy causes every year, and you can't help but feel what a good person you are compared to all those who roll through the stop signs. Is that sin? You're perfect in every way, but you pay taxes to a government that uses some of them to operate drones that sometimes kill innocent civilians. You protest against the drones, sure, but still, some of your money pays for them. Is that sin? Sin is confusing, to say the least, which is why so many theologians have spilled so much ink over it, and why so many of us people of goodwill who try to do the right thing still wind up doing it so much. So, in case you're wondering, because I think it's good for us to talk about at least sometimes, here are a few ways to understand it. The first way involved in understanding sin is to think about it in terms of archery. Some of you have heard me say this before, point out that the original terms for sin were archery terms and referred to missing the bullseye but still hitting the target. You might call this a directional understanding of sin. That's the definition St. Augustine first used for it, though later he would define it as a hardened heart. Archery. Is that all sin is? A mistake based in a lack of technical proficiency? Poor aim or bad eyesight or shaky hands? But what happens if you don't even know that you're in an archery match? Or what about people who aren't in the least even trying to hit the bullseye? Are the only people who sin the ones who are trying to be good, who enter the match on purpose? What about those who don't care? A second understanding. This is what I would call the sin as legality way of looking at things. Simply put, it means that there are rules and laws that you should follow. And if you break them, you have sinned. Boom. Easy. The Ten Commandments come to mind here, as do some way oversimplified descriptions of ancient Judaism. This is the way Judge Roy Moore in Alabama, with his Ten Commandments sculpture, wants you to think about sin. Some of Jesus' statements might qualify that way as well. But what happens when you're faced with a situation that nobody's made a rule about, that nobody's passed a law regarding? Or what about when there seem to be conflicting rules, as there certainly are in our Bible? What do you do then? A third way to understand sin, ethically. Here's what you do. You come up with a system for classifying right and wrong, good and bad, moral and immoral, or you adopt somebody else's ethical system. You don't come up with specific rules per se. You just try to understand what constitutes moral behavior. And from those general principles, you deduce what the right thing to have done in a given situation is. If you didn't do that right thing, then you sinned. This is the one that Aristotle and Heidegger are pulling for. The problem with this is that it can get pretty unwieldy. You might need a master's degree to tell you whether you should admit to the bride that her dress is unflattering. As for how big a deal it was that you flipped that other driver the bird this morning, you might need an entire symposium to decide. And also, there are plenty of ethical systems that have not one thing to do with God. In fact, that were designed to exclude God, which is fine for them, I guess. But since we're in a church and talking about Christian confession, it does seem that God ought to figure heavily in our definition. So, a fourth way, relational, or maybe you could call it interpersonal. Anything that breaks down relations with other human beings is a sin. This one seems good on the face of it. It covers things like violence, war, lying, theft. What it doesn't adequately address is what the other human beings we're talking about are like. For instance, if the other person is abusive or violent or toxic or addicted, is it really a sin to remove yourself from the relationship, to break down those relations? And what about those drones? You didn't have a relationship with those people who ended up being collateral damage, did you? So paying for the drones that bombed them doesn't really destroy a relationship because you didn't have one to begin with. Listen, we could go on all day. I mean, I haven't even gotten into Augustine's thing about how evil is simply a distortion of the good, or Aquinas' statement that sin is turning away from an immutable good toward mutable goods, or Calvin's thing about the total depravity of humanity. Seriously, we could be here for a long time, but because I care for you. Instead, I offer you the definition of sin that I hold to, and which is commended by the author of our Lenten text as well. It's what you might call a separational definition. A guy named Paul Tillich more or less came up with it in the last century. Ready? Here it is. Sin is anything that separates us from God, from others, or from our own best selves. So, the wedding dress. You lied and therefore broke a commandment, but you helped someone else feel good on a most important day, which strengthens your relationship with her. In this case, that's probably also what God longs for, and probably strengthens your own skills at kindness and empathy. Therefore, I pronounce it not sin. Skip confession that day. Your spouse that you gave the silent treatment to depends on why you're silent. Are you just punishing them, trying to make them feel as bad as you do? If so, then you might be separating yourself from them and from the most loving version of yourself. So maybe sin. But if you're staying silent because you're so mad and you're waiting until you can say something kind and conciliatory instead, or if you're silent because you're so sad you have no words, then maybe not sin. Depends. You and God decide whether it needs confession. It's worth praying about at least. Okay, you rule follower, the one who follows the rules all the way, never breaks any commandments or laws of any kind. You have all those complete stops under your belt, but it makes you feel superior to everyone else. Following the rules is usually not sin, though it can be sometimes. But looking down on people who don't do what you do, feeling superior to them, well, that's you distancing yourself from them and probably also from the God who wants you to love them deeply, so probably sin. You probably should confess. Taxes and drones, well, on the one hand, you're doing something to stop the violence, you're protesting the drones, but there's only so much that you as an individual can do to change things, and meanwhile, you really do need to pay your taxes, or all sorts of other consequences will come your way, some of which will affect your kids, your spouse, your church, your life. So let's call that systemic sin. You're not directly 100% responsible, but you're still caught up in it through no fault of your own. It's worth confessing, at least once in a while, to give you a push to keep working and to remind you that God's heart breaks whenever innocents die. The more you learn to think like this, the easier it is to do. The more you examine your past behaviors and patterns of behaviors, the better able you are to change them before they happen. The more you invite the shadow side of you, the grumpy bits, the pouty bits, the unfairly angry bits, the bits that secretly love doing that thing that pulls you away from God and the people around you, the more you do it, the easier it is. But let me be clear, if you're like the rest of us, you will never fully conquer sin. And that's not the point. The point is to name it work on it, and then let it go, rather than dwelling on the secret shame of it for the rest of your life. To remove its power over you in order to give God power over you. The point is to recognize it when you do it, to be reminded that you are, as the author of our Lenten book will tell you, not good in the sense that God or Jesus or your moralistic self will tell you, not good in that sense, but still fundamentally approved by God, and still beloved no matter what. And the more you turn toward that love, the more beautiful life gets. Jesus goes out into the desert, away from the God who has just named him her son at the waters of the Jordan. Jesus separates himself, or maybe is forcibly separated, from God and from the people. Why? So that he would know what it's like to be us. So he could feel what it was to walk away from God. To listen to the big, cool girl and steal the M&Ms and carry the secret for your whole life. So he would know what it's like to wander alone, to carry those secrets in his heart and long for someone to tell them to be tempted and maybe almost to give in, to admit that the shadow is real and to turn away from it. And then, in the end, to come home. May it be so for us as well. Amen.